All right, so this is kind of like hitting that last part. So obviously, if you didn't get to finish in that 13 minutes, not like you automatically submit or anything. But it's important to understand that even let's just say you were at home, right? And they have the option, you can take the test digitally. Now they're going to give us more information about how much time you would have for five, because now it would actually switch the exam, would change a little bit, where instead of it being they give you four questions, you pick three. If you did all digital, you would have five questions and you wouldn't really have a choice. So that's how they would change it. But if you let's just say you're taking the test in person, it would be the normal format. And I have the format on the board right now. This is the regular format of the test. And as I mentioned before, you have 40 minutes to complete it. So you have to do three questions. Generally, hitting that 13 minutes would be a very good time to hit on, because obviously if you run over that time, you might not have enough time to thoroughly complete each question equally. Okay. But obviously, if you finish one earlier, that means you can jump to the next one and you can kind of get more time. So don't be discouraged if you couldn't get to finish that 13 minutes. It's okay. That just means we have to practice being able to condense your information. All right. Because that's the big thing about the SAQs. It doesn't have to be an essay. It's just hitting the mark. That's the big thing. Okay. So the next part, and we'll do this is you can kind of do this on your own, because it's due by tomorrow, is to grade somebody else's. So once you post your response, you can then use the rubric to grade somebody else's response. Now, obviously, if you want to look at the rubric and see how'd you do, there's nothing wrong with that. But my suggestion, and I'm going to grade you based on you actually completing it and also grading someone's response. Okay, so that's kind of be the big thing for me. But as I mentioned, as long as you kind of be able to use the rubric and be fair. I mean, like I said, as long as you're being fair when you grade somebody, that's not a problem. So use the rubric, as I mentioned. You can download this to your computer if you want, and then just use it kind of like a side-by-side cam to kind of grade each other's responses. Okay. So, all right. So from there, we can now move on to the next part. So as long as you get this done by tomorrow, you're all golden. Okay. Any questions on that? We're okay. Cool. All right. So yesterday we had very interesting analysis of kind of cartoons that were created during Gilded Age. Very interesting. Like I actually embedded some of the cartoons in the background. This one was in the background, the looking backward, and the main cartoon I have for the entire unit is another famous cartoon right here, the Where the Blame Lies. These are all kind of interesting. And I say that with concern because during this era, the feeling towards immigrants was pretty horrible. And it was kind of basically, you have to understand, this nativist idea all sparks from the concept of, and that's why I always make the joke about South Park. They took our jobs. That's where it all comes from. It's literally that. Again, that's why I try to use that as best as I can. It's really hard if you ask a teacher, hey, have you ever used South Park to explain historical? They probably look at you sideways, but that's basically what it is. And we kind of analyze that in showing how the difference between the old immigrants and new immigrants has really, the only difference is that they believe in different religions or they are from different areas, but they practically came in the same way, right? And there are still a lot of this hatred towards these new immigrants. What we're going to do now is focus in on how this mass immigration really changes cities, right, in a drastic way. Okay, so the first part you have to understand is cities were getting better at developing transportation styles, that they started having, obviously development of railroads is really important to change from city to city, but within the cities themselves, they started to have more developed streets. They started to develop better equipped buildings. They started to even have more tram cars and things like that to help people travel from one place to another. And they even started to develop even subway systems. Even the bridges themselves, who now transport people from the suburbs right into the cities, is now going to have more people traveling to go to work, right? Commuting, right? Instead of, it used to always be, you usually work like 5 minutes away from when you lived because you would walk everywhere. But now they start to have, different means of transportation. People didn't want to live within the cities anymore. They want to live in the suburbs. They want to live a little bit further away so they could just commute right into the cities themselves. Okay. And on top of that, as I mentioned before, these buildings that people were starting to live in and work in, instead of building wider, they started to build upward, which is now building skyscrapers, which kind of ties into what Carnegie's most benefit was, because they needed steel, right? And who they buy it from? The guy who controls all the steel industry. All right. On top of that, with these new immigrants coming in, it was actually very difficult for them to really coexist with the old immigrants. So what they ended up doing was they actually started to settle into specific parts of the cities where they would connect each other's cultures. So for instance, I actually mentioned this yesterday, like Italians, when they came into the city, they migrated to one specific area, which ends up becoming like Arthur Avenue, right? Where all Italians kind of live in one part of the city. Little Italy, Chinatown, same thing. These are all examples of how now that part of the city becomes more culturally the same, because they felt as if it'd be easier for them to adjust by living amongst groups that they are similar to, right? And we start to see this happen on a very large scale. In most cities, this actually ends up happening. But in the inner city itself, becomes very overpopulated, crime-ridden, and makes a lot of people want to, like I said before, go into the suburbs, not live in the cities themselves. But on top of all this, we started to see a kind of a debate between private industry and really public industry, and where we start to see how, with increased level of like crime, disease, and like water waste and things like that, it actually starts to convince the public to try to change and try to regulate some of how horrible it is within these cities themselves. As in, they try to regulate some aspects of the city so that at least it's a little less horrible to live in there. And the government starts to try to crack down on some of these, kind of horrible things that are occurring. They start to create like things like sewage plants, have better street lighting, more funded police departments, and other things. They try to basically create this program called the City Beautiful Program. Pretty straightforward. Try to beautify the city, right? And by doing this, it makes it more attractive for people to try to go work in these places, and even try to have people, instead of just all moving out to the suburbs, to try to still be a part of the city life itself. Because obviously, if the whole place looks horrifying, there's no water to drink, no one's going to want to work there, right? And cities now become the bustling parts of the economy. But along with these mass migration into the cities, we start to see a aspect of what they call boss and machine politics. All right. Now, we've talked about machine politics before, right? We talked about Boss Tweed several times, and he's a perfect example of how basically these groups start to have a lot of political influence. Now, it doesn't mean that every political machine was evil, right? That's not what it means. Think of it like an interest group, right? Interest groups today, an interest group can basically be like symbolize, let's see, any particular group that has political influence, right? And that could be anyone, right? That could range from the NAACP. It can range from the the NRA. It could range from all different groups that have political influence. Now, the positives of these political groups is that they are political machines, is that they can get things accomplished by having influence over politicians, as in by having them do certain things in the positive way, like, hey, listen, we can fund your campaign if you do this. That could be positive. The other way, the negative, is you can see it with Boss Tweed controlling political parties to benefit himself. And he basically steals thousands upon thousands of dollars from the citizens by basically, by using political means. And that's the negative aspect of political machines. So you kind of have to understand that there's kind of two ways to look at this. Now, with this influx of political machines, with immigration showing how the cities were kind of run down, and the development of the middle class, we see a new age of reform. Okay. Now, these reforms are going to be really crucial to the Gilded Age, and they're actually going to carry over into the Progressive Era. Some of these reforms will start here and then just gain momentum carrying into the next unit. So what ends up happening is a lot during the earlier parts of the Gilded Age, they started to come out with a lot of literature that kind of explains like what are the issues of society, right? And one of the biggest ones that they go after is how poverty is still like stricken because of this laissez-faire type of economy that we're running, right? The whole idea of industrialization, right? We saw the big four, how they use their practices to basically destroy any sort of small business and hurt the consumer. So they end up writing a lot of literature that kind of shows and criticizes this hands-off economics that it's hurting so many different people. And what they do is they try to target how horrible the inequalities are of the average individual and how the wealth gap is just really expanding and changing so drastically that it's impossible for an average person to make it anywhere. And what they propose in a lot of this literature is to basically create a single tax on land. So a land tax, right? And this is going to obviously benefit those that don't own a lot of land. And for those that are like industrialists that have like massive amounts of like for their mansions that we talked about in their, all their steel plants, they have to pay a tax on all those things, which then could be used for other types of projects. Now, Edward Blaney is another writer here, ends up kind of writing about he actually writes a book that for the time being was seen as radical, but it's like, anyone ever see like Back to the Future? Like when they wrote like, oh, the future 30 years later, which I think was like 2015, they're like, we're gonna have flying cars, and you're like, no, we don't. What special happened in 2015? I don't think there's like anything like specifically special that happened. I think technical advancement we had in 2015.
I can't even remember.
By 2015,
The Segway.
the Segway. Oh yeah, the Segway. The Segway. What was it? What would they also call it? It's not just a Segway. Hoverboard, right? It was they call it like they make it sound cool at all. Hoverboard. Like the thing is a Segway. Like literally, you're just leaning on it and going forward. Because I was going in 2015. I was a sophomore. I just see people like riding hoverboards all around campus. Like, so kind of just wanted to shove them off of it. Like, honestly, when I saw them, because this is giant hill on my campus, and I'm walking up the hill, and I just see this person just hoverboarding. I really just want to shove them off the hoverboard. So he kind of writes this book, and it's called 2000 to 1887. So he's trying to like look into the future to the year 2000 and try to write what the future is like. And he sees that it's where society has eliminated poverty, has eliminated greed, and eliminated crime. Really? Has that worked out so far in the year 2000? Yeah, it didn't get fixed, that's for sure. But the point is that they are trying to kind of look at the industrialists and say, there's a big issue here. And that's like one of the big things they look at, but there's a lot of other reforms. But these books kind of jumpstart the idea, kind of put the idea in people's minds that we should reform society because we have to think of the future. Like, how would we want our grandchildren to live? And this is going to now jumpstart a lot of different movements that end up happening. So one of the big things that ends up getting pushed is the social gospel. Now, this is the idea that Christians use to kind of use Christianity, like their moral values, to try to fix the problems of society. Very similar to like when we talked about the Second Great Awakening. Remember how that kind of jumpstarted a lot of these earlier reforms that they tried to use? And they try to bring back that idea of using Christianity to try to fix some of these big issues. And it really started to be in Hell's Kitchen in New York City, right? And by looking at how horrible life was like in the urban areas, they started to kind of basically say, these are the basic things we need to fix, right? They kind of analyze Hell's Kitchen and say, we need to make a checklist of how all the horrible things that are going on in today's cities. And because of this earlier movement, the social gospel, it jumpstarts the middle class to kind of analyze and now take action. So we'll talk about some of the actual movements themselves that jumpstart because of this idea, right? So the first thing is going to be the settlement houses. And this was started by there's actually several of them that were started, but the most famous one was the Hull House in Chicago. Okay, now basically settlement houses were trying to help the poverty, how horrible the poverty was in these cities. And basically the whole point of them was to really help a lot of immigrants transition to becoming Americans. So they wanted to help them with learning English, help them learning a trade, and help just general poverty of the time period. And they were located throughout the cities, right? Specifically trying to target the most poverty-stricken areas of each of these major cities across the country, whether it's in Chicago, New York City. You can kind of look at the bigger cities of the time and say there's definitely settlement houses there. But within Hull House in Chicago, Jane Addams becomes creating probably the most popular of all these settlement houses, right? And she basically had her movement was able to jumpstart a lot of these settlement houses that end up growing and growing and growing, so that by 1910 we see around like 400 of them located throughout the country. Okay. Now, women's rights movement starts to even grow again, right? Remember, we talked about the women's rights movement with Seneca Falls, but now remember, I said last time that it was going to die down a little bit because the Civil War occurs, and no one's sitting there going to say we should fight for women's rights because the Civil War was a big issue going on. But because of now everything's kind of settled down, women's rights movement comes back, and now it's going to go into full force. In the progressive era, it's going to grow even more. But this is kind of jump starting that movement again. Now, we talked, like I said, we already talked about it. It started in 1848, but in 1890, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony had created the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or the NAWSA, which is now going to basically try to generate funds, generate more momentum to push for women's suffrage. Right, and this is now also not going to just end here. It's just going to grow and grow from this point. Next movement, the temperance movement. Similar to last time we talked with temperance. It's hard to kind of push this forward during a civil war. So same thing happens here. The temperance movement is going to grow again. And a lot of times this is going to be a big issue because with more people in the cities, right? Last time temperance was kind of just like a rural thing, where people were just drinking nonstop, and like whiskey was cleaner than water, right? And that was kind of the big problem. But with poverty now increasing in the cities, more people were having issues with alcohol because they were just drinking away their salaries. So this was a big problem. And excessive drinking caused for the middle class to kind of say, we need to fix this issue. We need to limit the amount that people are drinking. They started to have different things like the Women's Christian Temperance Union had basically tried to limit alcohol. They tried to even have the Saloon League, Anti-Saloon League, which was trying to limit the amount of saloons that were allowed to partake in giving alcohol out. And probably one of the most famous things was Carrie A. Nation, basically was seen as a radical at the time, basically would walk around with a hatchet and basically break into saloons and just start breaking all the beer barrels with her hatchet. Kind of crazy, kind of a badass, right? Right, and just walking out there with just a hatchet, just straight up in the picture, just showing the hatchet, like I got this ready for me. I got it right here, ready to roll, right? And that's the thing. So there's this increasing movement to try to kind of halt the expansion of alcohol drinking, right? But like I said, it's only going to start again and then going to progress forward into the progressive unit. Now, at the same time, we start to see more intellectual and cultural movements that will jumpstart some things that we even see today. Like, for instance, we'll talk about new types of amusements and spectator sports start because of the Gilded Age, these cultural advances that end up happening. So along with the temperance and women's rights movement, education starts to be reformed, creating more public schools than ever before. The fact is, they want to try to get the people within the city, specifically immigrants and others within these urban areas, to become more educated, more closer to being prepared to go to work in skilled positions. So they end up creating more of these public schools for general admission throughout the city, right? And more government funded instead of it being more privately funded. Higher education, colleges start to be created more and more, and they actually change the education system itself to be based off of Germany's. Now, the interesting thing is that what they want to do is have colleges be more based on research and kind of like student, how we have like driven learning today, where instead of like me talking, unfortunately, it's like me, instead of me talking to you the entire time, which I'm doing right now, it's more student learning itself, right? Like to give you like a research topic and say, all right, go out and research this. And that's what they want you to do. And then lastly, they want to try to create more more focused on education because they realize that within these cities, they do some experiments and say crime is on the rise because a lot of these people are uneducated. They have no way of making money in a skilled trade. So if you educate them more on a bigger scale, there's a better chance it'll be less crime. Okay. And that's kind of why schools started to develop. On top of this, we start to see new types of literature, like in books, like just books for consumers to read. All right. And it used to be based on romanticism. I remember we talked about during the early 1800s that they had started having these books that kind of were written about American heroes and stuff like that, like making drama about like George Washington being this patriotic hero and all these different founding fathers writing books about them. But now they're starting to change the way they write their books and focus on two types of genres: realism and naturalism. Realism is basically experiencing the everyday events and basically how people can be seen as relatable, right? And that's going to be the biggest thing you have to look at. Now, the Tales of Huckleberry Finn, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, is an example of use of realism. Basically, it takes more realistic approaches to how, instead of it being like a fantasy type of novel, like think of in the early 1800s, they wrote the Headless Horseman, right? That was no way, shape, or form a event that could happen naturally, like normal. Like obviously there's the legends of it, but like that's the point, it's a legend. But realism is now going to be focusing on things that actually can happen. So books like Uncle Tom's Cabin can be seen as a realism type of book because it's something that is happening on a daily basis during the time in which it was written. And then naturalism is basically focused on emotions and experience. And in this book, it's actually like The Call of the Wild. And this is actually a pretty interesting book. If you ever read it before, it's basically focusing on the story of this dog. Now might be thinking to yourself, well, one is talking about real life experiences, the other one's focusing on like animals and things like that. But the whole book itself is showing about emotions and how, trying to drive the story forward, showing loss and sadness and excitement and things like that. So we see these new types of literature really bringing a lot of attention to some major events going on during this time period. So we're going to stop here because obviously we're about to run out of time. So we're going to talk about the different type of arts like in music and amusements and spectator sports when we come back. Okay, so the only homework today is to do the Ed puzzle. All right, so if you completed the SAQ, that means all you have to do now is just grade somebody else's and then you're done with that assignment. Okay. Yeah, so just just reply to theirs, and then you can just say this is the score and just say why you gave them that score. Yeah, so like if I was gonna like Lorcan, if I was gonna go on yours, I'd just be like reply and then just type in my score and say why I gave you that score. Okay. All right, so that's it for us. Okay, guys. If you have, do you have any questions on anything? See ya.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, have a good day.